Well, birds are singing, little brown dog coffee. It's a good day for hot rodding. We are back on the 1947 Mercury Convertible project. From where I'm seated, you might be guessing that we're still fighting, trying to figure out how to get the rear suspension in to turn this car back into a roller. We ran into a lot of problems in the last two videos, and we're kind of, well, that's right where we are. Got a new plan, I think. It's kind of a plan. Sort of. Let's get after it. Welcome to Between the Sharks. This car looks like it's getting set up for the Baja 500 still. Now, at this point, there's no motor. There's kind of like a 1-inch lowering spring and a stock axle, and the front end is sky high because of all of those things. We have a drop axle to go in there. We got a helicopter flying over. Wait for it. The frame is still on jack stands. The axle is just kind of sitting in there, and the suspension is hanging loose. At this point, even though it's going to make it harder to work on, I should drop the frame to the ride height that I want, then work the suspension that way. What does that mean? Lower the car down to where I want the body to sit relative to the axle, and then just force the suspension to do my bidding and make the car sit that way. I don't exactly know how it's going to work, but it feels like the right approach. All right, so this is just a tire I had laying around. Here's a more something kind of tire that I'd like to run. It's a different bolt pattern, that's why it's not on the car. This is indeed a 16-inch forward rim. We'll probably run a 15-inch rim on this car. That said, it turns out that the tire height and overall height is close enough for us to get, generally speaking, where we want to go. So my ideal ride height is I like when the fender is tucked in just into the white wall. I barely stuck this fender on just so we could kind of see what that means. So for us, now that just dropped down. Huh. That wasn't supposed to happen. Just. So I mocked this fender up. That was a breeze. Where were we? All right. So the idea is, the guy's gonna run a tire that looks more similar to this. The way I like these things to look is the fender tucked in right on the top of the white wall. For us, roughly speaking, from where we are right now, it's an absolute minimum of coming down 4 inches is what we're going to call it. We use this one for reference. 4 inches is 4 inches, but still, generally speaking, it gets us right to the top of the sidewall. Helicopter's back. It's over there. It's a Black Hawk. It's kind of neat. So there you have it, fellas. We're looking at coming down 4 inches, maybe 4.5, into the top of our white wall. Similar on this sidewall. This just, it just looks cooler. I measured the front. The front needs to come down roughly 6, which I would say is about a 4-inch drop plus a motor, and that ought to get us pretty darn close. So, the guy's thinking, I'm gonna drop the car down roughly 4 inches, if I can. Basically just lowering the frame, because there's no suspension actually holding it up or tying it to the rear axle, which would bring the whole body down over the sidewall where I want. Then we're going to take a look and see what that does, where our cross member lines up, how our rear spring looks even though it's not attached, and what that's going to do for our ladder bars to help locate this whole rear end. In theory, because the ladder bars extend so far forward, we are also going to need to lower the front to our ride height before we find out the mounting point for those, but we'll get there kind of when we get there. And yeah, of course, the last thing to check once we've lowered the frame down around our suspension, pretending it's not attached at all, is just to see how much travel we have. I want a minimum of 3.5 inches of travel up before we hit the bump stop or the frame, but I'm willing to 86 or reduce the bump stop in order to get the ride height that we are indeed looking for. All right, let's see if we can start adjusting this guy a little lower and see what happens. Sound like a plan? Plan. Ready? Break. All right, gang, welcome to this genius idea. So my jack stands aren't gonna get low enough. I need the frame and all relative body parts attached to it to come down roughly 4.5 inches. You know, trying to do too many things at once with not enough hands, but short version is that's almost 4.5 inches. So I'm gonna pull the jack stand, put a deck block under the frame on both sides. That's gonna be our starting point. So this isn't quite the same thing as using a cinder block, boys. It's, you know, that's solid cast concrete. When you use a cinder block, those are notoriously brittle and not load bearing. So don't do that if you're gonna get under a car. I mean, do this, but not the other thing. All right, fellas, if you're thinking, why didn't you just make space in the garage with the concrete floor? It's somewhat level, smooth for this part of the project. I'd be thinking the same thing right now. That ship is sailed and wrecked and already sunk to the bottom because, you know, this is where we are. But, you know, I'm feeling the knees on gravel syndrome already. Pretty early. Let's see how this goes. All right. How we do? We got a lot more fitment of this fender to do, but generally speaking, we are a lot better. From the axle, ignoring the bracket for the ladder bars that's not attached, from the axle to the frame we got 5.5 inches. Axle to the bump stop is 3 and change. Obviously we can delete on some of that bump stop and get all the suspension travel we need. So that's cool. The issue I'm seeing now is it feels like we are going to be way off on this transverse spring mount. I mean, obviously it's not even, but I guess we need to get into that because ultimately it's a hot rod, right? So we can modify things until they work the way we want them to. Just saying this out loud, my concern is that the transverse spring may turn out not to be our best option here. For some reason, I just have an aversion to coil springs. Like, maybe because that was like really a street rod thing when I was starting to do this, and traditional hot rods were where it was at, and you know. While I'm laying here and we're discussing it, I guess what I'm saying is this rear end was set up for coilovers. Not coilovers, but coil springs. And so, in theory, a guy could just buy some A-body coil springs. They even make lowering coil springs for Chevelles and stuff. So we have options here. It would indeed be a lot of working backwards, but let's be real, guys. A lot of hot rodding is trial and error. That's sort of the whole thing. You know, that's kind of an interesting concept in my opinion, that there's still so much trial and error with hot rods, because I'm not doing anything new with a 46-7/8 Florida Mercury than has been done before. Like, not even, I'm breaking zero ground. But, you know, I'm finding that the transverse spring might not fit my final look. The other option is a leaf spring kit, which is about $1,000. That's what a lot of people do. But, you know, here I am working with a rear end that's already set up for coil springs, so that plus ladder bars and we should be in relatively good shape. I guess there's just a lot of ways to skin a cat or build a hot rod, or you know what I'm saying. So let's keep digging in. I just got to bring you in here, I think. I've been shifting the axle around and kind of looking at stuff for about an hour, recentering everything. Here, you can kind of see our general height, our frame, down to our axle. It's pretty good, actually. We're roughly, 6 inches right now, 4.5 to the bump stop. That does give us a little room to go down, but honestly, the car is looking better already. I'm trying to figure out where to mount these ladder bar radius rod things because I want them to come in line with the frame, sort of making a V, but I want them as far out as I can get them. Now that means tucked in just inside the frame rail. So the issue I'm running into right now is these are the brackets that I have to mount our rear radius rods. There's one halfway on there. It goes like so. And this particular bracket would go around the axle like that. The issue is that it wants to be kind of as far out as we can get it, but as you can see, that's suddenly limiting our suspension travel while not getting the car any lower, so we're not going to do that. I could move them in closer if I took these off and move them in, and then the other option is there's a bracket that hangs down like so that Speedway has available. They're only 20 bucks a piece. The problem is I don't have them, so I got to order them, and that would stall our progress. It would be easy enough to just remove these, move our brackets inboard, and move on with our lives, but it comes with two issues. One, that makes our ladder bar higher, and as you can see, it may interfere with our floor, because what I want to do is come off basically as straight as possible so that as we move up and down, it's the most even travel, because at zero, the arc that it's on up and the arc that it's on down will be the same. If it's lower and pointed up, we're just at different points of our circle for suspension travel, and then we have a higher risk of binding. We'll get into that a little bit once I get it mounted, but here's my hesitancy for cutting those brackets off. This is an A-body, rear end, whatever, stock Chevelle type of thing, you see, fellas. And that was a coil spring rear. Let's just pretend that for some reason I wasn't driven to use the stock style transverse Ford spring and use the stock style 68-ish Chevelle style spring and use those factory mounts. Well, grabbed a coil from a Speedway kit that I had, purchased a bunch of parts off a dude, like basically bought his project out. Had some stuff I just thought I would sell to make my money back. Haven't done that yet, so it was just sitting on the shelf. This is a 14-inch spring, which once it's compressed, it should be at about 9 inches, I believe, which would put it literally right there. Guess what else came with the kit? These mounts. They could go right on the frame, and if you look, it's perfect. I've already got a bunch of money and a bunch of time invested in this transverse rear spring setup, and just honestly, I'm looking at it now, and at this ride height, our cross member is almost in line with our spring perch. So this might not be the best idea. It's not like this will be the last hot rod, so we'll just be hanging on to these parts, but it's just starting to look like the coil spring rear end might be the best for our situation. You know, I never thought I'd put coil springs in a car, but that's an ego thing, you know? What, like, why engineer something harder when something like this is staring you right in the face? You know what I'm saying, fellas? It's a lot to think about because, you know, first of all, I don't want to give up on the transverse rear spring, but it's really dumb to just fight my way through. Like, first of all, No one will ever see it if I was concerned with that. And second of all, this is my car. I'm building it. Somebody wants to critique the kind of springs, then that's a different story. I don't know. If I put the lower ladder bar mounts right here, ran these coil springs, we'd basically be in business. And on top of that, you know, the whole Chevelle spring setup is not only available, it is, they basically sell lowering options as well. So they make a 9-inch tall spring, which would lower this even more, which would be kind of cool. And it turns out that, you know, it's the same as the C10 coil springs, which I've got a C10, so I can go take a look at that and see what the score is. And those things are abundant, so I might be able to get a set around here. Basically what I'm saying is I don't know what to do, but this seems obvious, which means ordering some more parts. Dang it. I could use this stock mount, but I could also cut that stock piece off, nail that on there, weld the upper piece in just next to the bump stop. This is already jacked and cut out, and I've got to deal with it anyway. In order to get this low, I'm clearly going to have to modify this cross member if I wanted to use the transverse rear spring, because, as you can see, the bottom of our cross member where the spring mounts here is not nearly far enough away from our spring mount. Those guys are just tack welded on. They could be saved for yet another project down the line. And seriously, we could just be moving forward. I'm not doing any more damage than already exists. The parts are literally sitting right here. I still need the newer brackets for the ladder bars, I think, to lower those so they have more travel. And then flexibility wise, this is too tall. Fella could just cut a coil out, you know? Some people heat springs, some people cut coils. Internet says don't do either. Well, the internet says a lot of things. So maybe we'll move forward with this and not look back. I think that's what we're gonna do. It's just obvious at this point that that is, you know, a better situation. I gotta dig in and decide whether that stock mount is gonna work better than, you know, this thing in its place. And there's two differences. The springs I have, first of all, they fit this diameter thingy better. The Chevelle spring is a small pigtail here that gets wider and wider, but that could obviously be an issue there. And yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing is moving the mount forward, it will be slightly higher back here, you know, up this way. So maybe moving directly over the top of the axle is indeed better at this point. Maybe we'll just do that. I'm weirdly excited about this. It's time for some introspection, some real self-assessment here, because I'm looking at the solution. It's a Speedway Motors coil spring kit thing that I bought with a batch of parts that I would never have caught myself dead looking for or purchasing independently. And why is that? I grew up with a clique of hot rodders thinking that traditional was cool and traditional was just done one way, knowing two things full well. One, coil springs were ultimately added to cars by the late 50s. So there's potential argument that that could be traditional. Second of all, I don't know why I didn't like straight rods, you know? Those guys were trying to build stuff to drive daily, and now street rod's out, but resto mod is super in. And I like to think myself grittier or above that, but that's ridiculous. That's just absurd. It's all hot rodding, right? I like what I like, one, because I'm just drawn to it and I like it. But second of all, I'm drawn to things that I know. And I've said before, talking about this project, my goals are driving under modern conditions in city traffic. So I need to be able to do 70 miles an hour. Why am I so conflicted over just putting coil springs in the rear suspension when it's like, engineering wise, it is my simplest solution to get the ride height that I want to look cool, and most likely the most high quality ride height considering how low I want to get it. Nothing wrong with a transverse, rear spring, and I can even get the ride height I want. But I would have to just hack this cross member to bits, flatten it, pancake it, and that's so much work just to prove that I'm not a guy that puts coil springs in. That's insane. That is insane. So let's get after it, because we still need to order the brackets for our ladder bar slash rear radius rod things. But, if I stop going back and forth, I'll bet I can have these coil springs kind of set up and tacked in here before the day is over. Make the Mercury a happier place to be.